If you've ever believed Bigfoot was just a legend, maybe you've never seen how it sat beside a dying man for 10 nights, never once leaving. Sam Dwyer, a reclusive woodworker in Hollow Creek, lived alone for decades after losing his wife. Until one snowy night in 1969, he found something caught in a trap. Not quite beast, not quite human. He saved it. And from that moment, he was never truly alone again. Decades later, as Sam lay in hospice, he whispered, "He's still out there." His young nurse thought it was just a dying man's rambling, until the camera outside turned on its own, and Sam smiled. He came. This is not a story about monsters. It's about loyalty, kindness, and a silent bond deeper than words. Based on the journals of a man no one believed, and the eyes of a nurse who saw what she couldn't explain. This tale asks, what if the most faithful love comes from where we least expect? Watch till the end and you'll understand why real connection doesn't need language. Only presence. We'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from? How far can a story like this travel? From the snowy ridges of Wyoming to your screen today. Drop us a comment and let us send you our warmest hello from the quiet woods of Hollow Creek. He had once carved his name into a pine beam of that mountain with a jackknife, back when his hands were still steady, back when his lungs didn't rattle like wet leaves in wind. Now Sam Dwyer, 70 next fall, lay still beneath a thin white sheet in a hospice room where everything smelled like rubbing alcohol and softly used books. The window faced east. It always had. They didn't mean anything by it, these nurses, these girls with kind eyes and too many other patients to remember. But that window, it looked out toward Timberline Ridge, and that meant more than they could ever guess. Most days, Sam didn't speak unless someone asked him to. And even then, he spoke like the past had been embalmed in honey and cottonwood smoke. Words came slow, as though dug from snow. But each morning, even when his body wouldn't let him shift more than a few inches, his eyes drifted toward that window like birds migrating back to where they were born. Something waited there. Or maybe someone. He whispered to the silence sometimes. "He's still out there," he'd say. Soft, reverent, like a prayer no one had taught him. One of the nurses thought it was a ghost. Another joked about an old hunting dog. But Caroline Reeve, 29, 2 months into her new job, skin chapped from Wyoming wind and heart bruised from a city she no longer belonged to, Caroline didn't laugh. She watched. Quietly. From her chair by the monitors, or the far corner of the room when changing IVs. She noticed Sam's eyes brighten, just slightly, when the clouds broke over Timberline. And she noticed the way he didn't look scared when they wheeled in a new oxygen tank. Just tired. Like he was still waiting for something that hadn't come yet. Or someone. It was early November when the first snow came. Just a whisper of it across the sidewalk. Still wet, not sticking. Caroline came on shift at 5 a.m. and found Sam already awake, his chest rising shallow beneath the covers. His gaze was fixed on the window. "It snowed," she said, just to fill the room with something warmer than beeping. He didn't answer, just kept watching the trees beyond the glass. She walked over, adjusted the blinds to let in more light, and caught something odd on the sill. A smear of dry earth. She leaned in. No, mud. But the pattern was strange, not like boots or gloves. It was broad, uneven, almost like a handprint, but too big, too asymmetrical. The fingers didn't match up. She brushed it with her sleeve and paused. It was dry. From last night? Caroline glanced out again. The trees stood still in the distance, pine and spruce, half veiled in fog. Nothing moved. The grounds crew hadn't been in yet, and the security camera mounted above the exit door below was crooked, tilted sideways like someone had nudged it, or maybe slapped it hard. That night, the wind rattled the old window frames. the kind of wind that sounded like it carried old voices through the halls. Sam had fallen asleep after his dinner of applesauce and crushed-up pills, but around 2 a.m., Caroline was doing her rounds when she heard the call light beep once, just once, from his room. No one else had touched it. She entered quietly. The room smelled faintly of cedar smoke. That didn't make sense. Sam was sitting up. No machines had beeped, no alarms. But his eyes, those old, cloudy eyes, were brighter than she'd ever seen them, lit from some place inside that no morphine could touch. His mouth opened. The sound came like ash on the wind. He came. Caroline turned toward the window. The blinds were open just a crack. She walked closer, her breath misting as if the cold had slipped in through the seams. There was nothing out there at first, just shadow and snow and the faint glint of ice crusting the trees. But then, movement. Not a bird, not a deer. Something large, upright, steady. It moved away from the building without urgency, disappearing into the darkness between trees, leaving no sound behind but the hush of falling snow. She froze, not from fear, from the deep, sick certainty that whatever that shape had been, it had stood there a long time, watching, not malicious, not curious even, just waiting. When she turned back, Sam had reached out a trembling hand. She took it. His grip was faint but real. His voice rasped low, close to his ribs. "When I go," he said, "take me home. He deserves a goodbye." There was no mistaking the plea in his face. Not just a dying wish, but something older, deeper. A promise that had waited too long to be kept. She nodded. Not because she understood, but because the weight of that window, and the way the shadows leaned toward it, and the way Sam stared at it like it was a cathedral, none of that could be ignored anymore. In the days that followed, she couldn't stop thinking about the handprint, the camera, the way the snow didn't crunch under anything's feet. She asked the night nurse casually if the cameras had gone out. Probably the wind, the woman had shrugged. Or a raccoon, but Caroline didn't believe that anymore. Every morning she found Sam still watching, and though his chest grew weaker and the pain meds got stronger, his eyes stayed sharp, as if he knew time was closing, as if he could hear the wind saying goodbye. She started reading to him from his own notebook, a little leather-bound thing that sat untouched on his table, until one morning he gestured toward it. Inside were scraps of dates, scrawled memories, a list of stars he'd once memorized to help him find his way back from Timberline when he'd lived alone up there years ago. Some pages were unreadable. Others had only one line, "He's still out there." And beneath that sometimes, Rune. No one explained the name. Sam never said it out loud, but he smiled when she said it gently one morning, almost without meaning to. Rune. That night, as the wind picked up again, Caroline stood once more at the window. The clouds parted for just a breath, and moonlight painted a pale silver path down through the trees. Nothing stirred. No footprints marked the snow, but the air felt full. Full of what, she didn't know. She turned away slowly, the weight of something unseen resting between her shoulders like a hand not quite touching. Sam slept, restless but peaceful. No dreams he remembered, just breath, just time. And through the glass, far beyond the reach of the parking lot lights, the trees of Timberline stood watching back, tall, dark, and patient. The mountain didn't speak, but it remembered. And so did he. The next morning, when the sun rose pale and reluctant over the ridges, Caroline opened the window just a crack. Not enough to let the cold in, just enough to let the room breathe. Sam's hand found hers again, and for a long time, neither of them said a word. Because sometimes silence is how stories begin, or how they end, or maybe both. And behind them, on the windowsill, the smear of that strange dry mud had returned, faint, but real, just like the heartbeat of something that had never quite left, and maybe never would. And Sam, without looking away from the mountain, smiled. A slow, knowing thing, he whispered, almost too low to catch. "Still here." Then silence again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a door had opened, and something had come through, or was waiting to. Not yet, but soon, soon, and that window stayed open. Just a crack, just enough, because he wasn't gone. Not yet, and neither was the promise. It was the winter of 1969 when Sam Dwyer disappeared from town. Folks in Riverton barely noticed. A few men from the Elks Lodge asked around for a while, mostly out of habit, not concern. A gas station clerk remembered Sam buying kerosene and nails. Someone else said they'd seen him hauling lumber in the back of a rusted-out Dodge. But nobody asked why a man would haul lumber in December, when the ground froze solid, and the only thing moving through the forest was wind and things with hooves. Sam had lost too much by then for anyone to question where he was headed. His wife, Margaret, had been crushed in the mine collapse out near Crow Peak. Her name was the last one pulled from the list of the dead. Their son, Eddie, had drifted off years before that, heading west with no forwarding address. What was left of Sam had hollowed out from the inside, like a barn left to rot with the door swinging open. So he did the only thing that made sense. He packed what tools he had, found a patch of land nobody wanted up in Hollow Creek, and built himself a cabin where the trees didn't ask questions. That part of Wind River Range wasn't easy country. The soil turned to stone under shallow snow. Winds cut through pine like knives. But Sam worked through it anyway, stacking logs by hand, splitting kindling until his shoulders burned, patching gaps in the roof with tar paper and prayer. No electricity, no roads worth naming, just silence and memory and fire. That winter he wore his grief like a second coat. Never took it off, never looked in mirrors. Just worked and slept and waited for something to settle inside. It was in the middle of February, when the moon was low and the nights ran longer than the days, that it happened. The fire had gone low that night. Sam had just put on another log when he heard it. Not the wind, not snow dropping from branches. Something else. Soft at first, like breathing, like a faint whimper pressed through the wall. He froze, listened. It came again. A sound between a cry and a growl. Not close, but not far either. He opened the cabin door slow, shotgun by the frame but untouched. The air outside bit his face. It was snowing lightly, the flakes drifting sideways like they weren't sure where to land. For a moment, he saw nothing. Just the outline of trees and the dark ribbon of the creek frozen over. Then, movement. Something shifted near the woodpile. He stepped forward, heart thudding, boot crunch sinking deep, and there it was, a shape, crumpled. Small, maybe 3 feet tall, covered in tangled dark fur matted with blood and ice. One leg was caught in something, metal, a trap. He cursed under his breath. Not at the creature. At the men who still set those damn things out here like the woods belonged to them. He came closer. The thing didn't snarl, didn't bolt. It didn't have the strength. It just looked up, and in that instant, something shifted in him. It wasn't a bear cub, wasn't a coyote. It was something else. Its face was wrong, or maybe too right, like it belonged in both worlds and neither. Beneath the grime and fur, skin like pale bark peeked through. Its eyes, amber, deep set, watched him without flinching, and its hands. He saw the thumb first, then the fingers, long, calloused, real. He knelt. Didn't speak. Didn't breathe for a moment. Then, wordless, he reached for the trap and started working the rusted springs. The metal creaked. Bit back once, slicing his knuckle. He didn't stop. The snow fell harder. The air felt like a held breath. The trap let go. The creature whimpered once, like a child biting down pain. Sam wrapped it in the spare blanket from his porch chair and carried it into the cabin. It weighed more than he expected. Not like a raccoon or a fox. It was solid, dense. His back ached by the time he got it inside. He laid it on the old braided rug near the stove. The fire popped. He set another log, then gently unwound the blanket to check the leg. The wound was deep but not fatal. Bruised, swollen, no break. He cleaned it with warm water and whiskey, then bandaged it with the last of the gauze he'd used years ago when Margaret twisted her ankle hiking near Horseshoe Lake. He didn't talk, just worked. But he kept glancing at its face. It watched him back. No blinking, just breathing, labored, slow. He gave it water in a tin cup. It didn't touch it at first. Then, slowly, its hand reached out, took the rim, sipped, and then the noise came again. Not from the creature, from outside. A long, low sound. Not a howl, not a shout. Something deeper. It rolled down from the ridgeline like thunder through bone. Sam stood, walked to the door, opened it. Wind rushed in. Snow blinded for a second. Then, through the falling white, he saw it. Up on the ridge, still, watching. Tall. Too tall. A figure, towering above the brush, framed by the bend of the trees, dark against the moonlight. Not a bear, not a man, not moving. It stood there, arms at its side, breath steaming in slow plumes. The same eyes, he could feel them, staring down, judging, waiting. Sam didn't move, didn't raise his hand, didn't grab the shotgun. He just stood there. For a long time the world held still. Then the wind shifted, carrying the snow sideways again, and the shape was gone. Just the ridge, just the trees, just silence. He closed the door gently, turned back to the small form near the fire. It had curled in slightly, face toward the warmth. He sat beside it. Not close, just near enough to feel the heat on his knees. He picked up the tin cup and placed it where its hand could reach it again. "We'll make it through, kid," he said softly. The words surprised even him. The fire cracked again. A soft glow danced across the cabin walls. Shadows flickered over old photos, over the rough pine table, over the empty rocking chair no one had sat in since '62. The creature didn't reply, but its eyes opened again, just a slit. And for a moment, in the firelight, Sam swore he saw something familiar in them. Not human, but not beast either. Fear, maybe, pain, for sure, but also trust. A raw, silent trust that hadn't been earned. Not yet, but was being offered anyway. And Sam, broken in ways he didn't speak of, felt something shift in his chest. Not healing, but maybe the start of it. Outside, the wind carried one last breath of sound down the ridge. Not a voice, not a word, just presence. The cabin settled into quiet. The stove pulsed with heat. Snow layered over the roof like a blanket tucking them in. And somewhere out in the dark, something enormous stood guard. Unseen, unmoving, waiting, not for war, but for the return of something that mattered. The fire didn't go out that night, and neither did the bond being built, quiet and slow, between a man who'd lost too much and a creature born of wilderness and silence. Neither knew what would come next, but both knew, for now, they were no longer alone. The days came quiet and stayed that way. In the early light that slid through the small window panes and across the wood floor, the cabin held its breath, like even the dust was listening. Sam Dwyer moved slower now, not from age, but from a kind of awareness, like something fragile had entered his world, and any noise too sudden might break it. The creature, still unnamed, still wordless, slept near the stove on a pile of blankets that Sam had layered over pine boughs for softness. It breathed in shallow bursts at first, whimpering now and then in its sleep, flinching at thunder, at the creak of the rafters, even at the sound of wind dragging across the eaves. But it stayed. Sam didn't talk to it much. He wasn't a man who wasted words, and besides, he wasn't sure if words were what it needed, or what it understood. He just called it kid once, out loud, more to himself than anything, and it had turned its head, slow and steady, like it recognized something in that sound. So the name stuck. He didn't dare call it anything else. The first few mornings, it watched him like a hawk watches a rustle in the grass, alert, unreadable. Sam chopped wood outside, and when he came back, he found the kid crouched by the stove, sniffing the edge of the frying pan like it was trying to learn what hunger smelled like. It didn't eat much at first. Mostly berries from a jar, softened bread soaked in broth, the meat from a rabbit he'd snared the week before. Sam set the food down and turned away each time, letting it decide when to move. But it learned fast. It watched how Sam scraped the plate, how he held the hatchet, how he stacked firewood tight against the wall to keep it dry. And one morning, just after sunrise, while the kettle hissed low on the stove, Sam felt something behind him. He turned slow, expecting the usual, just that quiet amber stare. But the kid had stepped close, one massive hand outstretched, resting lightly on the edge of the workbench where Sam had been carving a replacement handle for his shovel. It didn't speak, didn't touch the tools, just placed its hand there, rough palm down, beside Sam's chisel marks, watching his fingers move like it wanted to remember every motion. Sam didn't say anything, just breathed out through his nose and kept working. They spent the days like that, side by side without speaking, separated by species, but not by rhythm. The snow deepened, but the cabin stayed warm. At night, Sam sometimes woke to the sound of movement, heavy, soft steps pacing near the door, as if the kid wasn't used to sleeping so close to a roof. Once, he heard it pressing its face near the window, not trying to escape, just looking. The fourth day, Sam felt the first real shift. He had been coughing again, dry, sharp coughs that bent him over at the waist and left his ribs aching. Winter always made it worse. He leaned against the stove, hand clutching the edge for balance, and before he could catch his breath, he felt the kid come near. Not rushing, not startled, just present. It reached out with its long fingers, almost tentative, and placed its hand gently on Sam's chest, right where his breath stuck. Sam didn't move. The hand was warm, not hot like fever, but alive, steady, grounding. The kid's head tilted slightly, like it was listening with something deeper than ears. Then it stepped back again, curling up near the fire without a word. Sam didn't tell anyone that story. Not that there was anyone to tell, but he remembered it, the way a man remembers the one day in spring when the snow begins to melt, and he realizes he's made it through another season. The days stretched. Sam started setting out tasks, small ones. He'd drop kindling beside the stove, then nod toward the wood pile, watching to see what the kid would do. It responded slowly at first, confused, as if the idea of doing something just to help was foreign. But it caught on. Before long, it was dragging logs inside, awkwardly, like its strength hadn't figured out how to be gentle yet. One day, Sam left his canteen near the creek and didn't go back for it. That night, it was on the porch again, filled and placed beside the door. Something about that hit Sam deeper than it should have. Another morning, Sam took out his knife and began whittling near the stove. The kid watched, as always. When Sam reached for another piece of pine, he paused, then offered the one he'd finished. Just a carved little bear, nothing special. The kid didn't take it at first, just looked at it. Then, slow as a river thawing, it reached out and turned the bear over in its hands. That same afternoon, they heard a sound neither of them liked, a gunshot. Far off, but not far enough. The kid froze, muscles coiled. Sam's blood turned cold in his veins. The shot echoed once more, then silence. He reached for the rifle by the door. But before he could open it, the kid was already moving, fast, quiet, pulling Sam gently but firmly toward the far wall, where the old root cellar door lay half covered in coats. It pressed him behind the stove, crouched in front of him, its body shielding Sam's like a sentinel. They waited like that for a long while. Sam's breath shallow. The kid's eyes locked on the door. No one came. The sun dropped behind the ridge. Shadows stretched long and thin. And then, from beyond the trees, a shape appeared. Sam didn't have to look through the window to feel it. But he did anyway. He peeked through the corner crack in the curtain and saw it. Tall, unmoving, half lit by moonlight. It didn't approach. Just stood at the tree line, watching. The same way it had before. Its face caught the silver edge of the moon. Broad, human-like, but older, wiser. Eyes like fire that had cooled to embers. Sam stood slowly. The kid moved with him, close behind. They stepped onto the porch together. The cold hit his skin, but the kid didn't flinch. Out at the edge of the woods, the figure remained. Then it turned, and in its place, Sam saw the path it had come down. Fresh tracks in the snow. Wide, deep. But something else caught his eye. The trap was gone, the one that had held the kid. Sam squinted. Where it had been, there were 2 long drag marks in the snow, leading away into the woods. Taken, removed, disposed of. He swallowed hard, and somewhere in his chest, something settled that had been restless for years. "Thank you," he said into the dark. There was no answer, just the sound of wind over snow, and silence that didn't feel empty, only listened to. When he went back inside, the kid followed close, not behind him, but beside. And in the morning, when the sun rose soft and pink over the ridge, Sam stepped outside and found something carved into the frost on the porch rail. A single curved line, a shape he didn't recognize. But he didn't wipe it away. He left it there, let it melt in its own time, like everything else in Hollow Creek. And inside, the fire kept burning, and the kid stayed. And Sam, for the first time in years, didn't mind waking up. By the time spring bled into summer and the creeks filled with meltwater, Hollow Creek no longer felt like a place of exile. It had become something gentler, something known, like a song played quietly in the back of the mind. Sam Dwyer had long since stopped asking why the kid hadn't left. He didn't need a reason anymore. It was just the way things had settled between them. Wordless but whole. The kid stayed close, never too far from the cabin but never quite inside it after that first winter. It seemed to understand the rhythms of the place, moving through the woods like it belonged there, which it did more than any man ever had. And Sam, for all his silence, found comfort in the evidence left behind. Tracks in the mud. Bark shaved clean on the far side of the clearing. Pine cones broken open just so. A rhythm of return that became, with time, almost sacred. That first summer, Sam built a new stall behind the cabin. Not for the kid, for the Mustangs. A young gray had broken its leg 2 ridges over. Sam hauled it back in a makeshift sled, whispering half-hearted promises that he'd try to help. That night, while the colt trembled under the eaves and Sam sat by the fire wondering if he'd done the right thing, the kid appeared again, just a silhouette in the tree line, still as dusk. It watched the wounded horse, then disappeared into the brush. By morning, the horse was standing, shaky, favoring its leg, but standing. Sam didn't question how. He added a trough, fenced a pen, made things sturdier. Sometimes in the morning he found branches cleared from the trail like something had dragged them off with purpose, like it didn't want the horse to trip. Sometimes a woven bunch of reeds appeared at the edge of the woods, tight, like a child's first braid. In town, folks said Hollow Creek had ghosts. Kids dared each other to hike out that far and never made it more than a mile. But every so often, stories trickled back. Kids swearing they saw someone tall watching them from the tree line, never moving, never speaking, just there. And they always came back, even the ones that got turned around. Somehow, they always found the path again. Sam never said a word. He just kept working, let the stories grow legs. In late July, during a dry stretch where the creek ran low and the air buzzed with insects, a wildfire cracked through the next valley. Sam smelled it before he heard it. Wood smoke, thick and biting. He turned off the gas, wet the roof, packed his tools. But the wind shifted that night, sending the flames north instead. The next morning, His fences still stood, but something was different. In the clearing near the tree line, the brush had been cleared. Not burned, not broken, just gone. Like someone had swept a path wide enough for his horses to run. Like someone had made sure they had a way out. The kid hadn't shown itself that week, but Sam found a mark carved low on a birch trunk. Deep, firm strokes, like a warning or a message, or maybe just a way of saying, "You're not alone." He ran his hand over it once, then let it be. Seasons turned again. The leaves went yellow, then red. Then they dropped, like coins spent too quickly. Winter rolled back in like it never left. That year the kid didn't come close, but Sam still knew it was out there. Some nights, when the wind blew right, he'd hear a low whistle echo off the rocks. Not music, not bird call, just a sound meant to be noticed, meant to carry. Other nights, when snow blanketed the ground without sound, Sam would wake and find shapes in the snow. Not tracks, not really, just pressure, as if something heavy had stood a long while by the porch and left before the sun rose. He never lit the lantern when that happened. Didn't want to scare it. Didn't want to break whatever tether had formed, invisible and strong, between his world and something older. And then one night in March, a storm rolled through like it had claws. Wind howled down from the ridgeline. Ice rattled the cabin walls. Sam was fixing the lock on the front door when he noticed something strange. A chair he'd been carving on the porch had been moved. Not far, just turned. Slightly. Now it faced east, toward the sunrise. He stood there, hand on the frame, heart caught mid-beat. Only he and Margaret had ever done that. Turned the chairs to catch the first morning light, back when they still drank coffee together before chores. The kid couldn't have known that. Unless it did. He didn't move the chair back. Didn't mention it aloud. He just left the front door unlatched that night, a little crack wide. The way you leave a gate open for someone who knows how to return. Spring crept in slow. That kind of season where meltwater doesn't trickle so much as sigh, and tree buds peek like shy children around corners. Hollow Creek softened. The air smelled sweeter. Sap ran thick. The horses grew restless, and Sam kept noticing things. Stones arranged in a loose half-circle near the trail. A branch bent at a strange angle, stripped bare of bark, left leaning against the barn. One morning, a wooden figure, rough, no bigger than a thumb, rested on his porch rail. It looked vaguely like a man, or maybe not. The features were too vague, but its posture said something, like watching, like remembering. Sam kept it, tucked it in the cabin window facing out. Years passed. Sam got older. The kid, if it was still the same one, grew too. He saw it only once more during those years. Late summer. A dry dusk, with the air sharp and still. Sam was mending the gate when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Across the valley near the far ridge, a figure stood, taller than before, shoulders wider. Its fur darker now, matted in places from sap or dirt or time. It didn't move, just watched. Sam stood, raised his hand, slow and sure. The figure paused, then lowered its head slightly. A gesture, a goodbye, or maybe just a promise that it hadn't forgotten. Then it turned, walking back into the timber with a stillness that felt final. Not forever, just for now. That night Sam didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, hands curled over his knees, the air inside the cabin thick with old breath and pine resin. He thought about the silence, about how many years had passed without words, and yet still somehow said enough. He thought about that kid, now grown, somewhere out there beneath the canopy, moving through shadow like a whisper that belonged. And before dawn, he stepped outside with a chisel and a scrap of cedar plank. He knelt near the creek, beside the smooth stones worn down by time, and he carved a handprint into the wood. Long fingers, broad palm. Not perfect, but honest. He staked it into the earth beside the bend, where moss grew thick and cold. Left it there, didn't tell anyone, didn't write it down, just offered it, the way you offer thanks to something that doesn't ask for it. By the time the sun rose over Hollow Creek again, The plank was still there, but the moss beside it had been disturbed, pressed down gently as though something large had knelt for a long while, then stood and left. In silence. Sam didn't need more than that, because some friendships aren't built on daily visits or spoken vows. They're made in the act of staying, even when it's from a distance, even when the world says it doesn't make sense. And in the quiet that followed, Sam knew this wasn't a story that would ever end neatly. Because some stories aren't meant to end. They're meant to echo, to rustle in the trees when no one's watching, to step just out of view, to turn a chair to the light and vanish again before the door opens. And somewhere in the space between myth and memory, a path remains swept clear. It started with a page, just one, curled at the edge, tucked into the spine of an old leather-bound notebook that smelled like pine sap and thyme. Caroline found it by accident, wedged beneath Sam's wool blanket in the hospice room the day he slept through his blood pressure check. The notebook wasn't labeled. No dates, no name. Just pages and pages of looping script that slanted slightly right, like it leaned toward memory. Most of it was nonsense, she thought at first. Half-finished sketches of trees, scribbled thoughts about cloud shapes, lists of birds long gone from this part of Wyoming. But near the back, tucked between two blank sheets, the word jumped out like it had been waiting for someone to notice. Rune. She stared at it for a while. The letters were deep, heavy, like they'd been pressed with intention. The ink had bled slightly through to the next page. She traced it with her finger. No context, no definition, just that single word, sitting in the quiet. After that, she couldn't stop reading. Page after page unfolded into strange fragments. One line read, "He watched me fix the hinges today. Didn't blink once." Another said, "I left the berries on the stump and they were gone by morning." Then, "He only comes when the wind moves east." And below that, carved with something sharper than a pen, "Rune doesn't fear winter the way we do. He's made of it." Caroline had been a nurse for 7 years. She'd sat beside too many beds, held too many hands, watched too many monitors flatline to be startled by the odd things people said when death hovered close. But this wasn't dementia. These entries were dated, detailed. They stretched across years, the name Rune repeated like a prayer or a promise. She kept the notebook to herself for a few days, read it during breaks in the staff lounge, or while Sam slept, always careful to return it to the drawer before rounds. And with each entry, the picture sharpened. This wasn't about an imaginary friend or some spiritual metaphor. Sam believed Rune was real, that he had lived with him, hidden him, protected him, loved him, in a way that had nothing to do with blood or species. Rune had a hand with fingers. Rune had eyes like amber. Rune learned to breathe beside the stove. She started Googling things at night. Bigfoot theories, cryptid maps, Wind River legends. It was mostly garbage. Crackpot websites with flashing fonts and low-res photos. But still, she read. Not because she was convinced, because something in the way Sam wrote, something in the steadiness of it, the ache, it made her want to see where the words had come from. Hollow Creek. It wasn't on most maps. Just a half-forgotten finger of valley land tucked into the western edge of the range, where the roads stopped pretending to be paved. She called in a personal day, told no one, borrowed a friend's Jeep, drove with a notebook in her backpack and Sam's voice in her head, whispering through the pages. He'd written, "It's where the silence knows your name," and she didn't understand it until she turned off the highway and the trees swallowed her whole. The trail was worse than she expected, more overgrown, but something kept pulling her forward. Maybe it was just curiosity. Maybe something older. She found the cabin near sunset. It looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The roof still sagged to the left. The steps creaked even under her weight. The door opened without protest. Inside, it was dust and memory. A single chair by the stove. A rusted kettle. Shelves lined with mason jars now clouded over with time. And on the back wall, carved deep into the grain of the wood, the word again. Rune. This time it wasn't ink. It was carved with something sharp, deliberate. Each letter nearly an inch deep, slanted forward like it was trying to walk off the wall. She touched it. The wood was smooth, as if years of wind had passed through the cabin and polished it down. She took a step back. Her breath fogged slightly, though the air wasn't that cold. She turned to leave, but something about the forest outside had changed. It had gotten quiet. Not woods quiet. Not wind through pine quiet. This was stillness. Heavy. Like something had paused the world just outside her reach. She walked the trail beyond the cabin, just a few yards, then a few more. The trees pressed close, and then she saw it. A scratch along a tree trunk about 7 feet up. Not a claw mark, not random. A single smooth strip of bark removed clean, revealing the pale wood underneath. She passed another tree with the same mark, and another. She should have turned back. But she didn't. The rain came fast, unexpected. It started as mist, then thickened, soaking her sleeves, her hair. The trail turned to mud. She lost her footing once, caught herself on a root, laughed out loud just to hear something human. That's when the steps started. Slow, heavy. Behind her, but not chasing. She stopped, turned. Nothing. Just the sound of water dripping off leaves. She moved forward again. So did they. A few steps later, she froze. The path split at a small stream, swollen from the storm. On the far side, framed by gray light and trees, something stood. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. Its fur was soaked, dark and matted, hanging off its limbs like a heavy coat. Its shoulders were wide, arms long, but it stood upright, balanced, still. And its face was wrong and right, all at once. Not monstrous, not animal. A human-like wild man face, weathered and furred, but with skin beneath, pale, expressive, and too honest to belong to a dream. Its eyes caught hers. Amber, just like Sam wrote. Not glowing, just watching. It didn't move, didn't growl, didn't threaten. It just breathed. Each exhale puffed into white mist against the cold. She stared. Time slid sideways. Her heartbeat was so loud she could hear it in her ears. Then the ground beneath her shifted. Her boots slipped. She gasped, arms flailing, one leg dipping toward the stream. But something moved. A branch. Thick, solid, from nowhere. It angled upward, catching her weight, holding her like a lever of earth itself had bent to protect her. She blinked, looked up. He was gone. The woods across the stream were empty. No sound, no breath, no shape. Only the rain, only the mist. She scrambled back to the trail. Her legs shook all the way to the cabin. When she got there, she slammed the door behind her and leaned against it, lungs on fire. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat in Sam's old chair, stared at the word on the wall, and whispered one sentence. He's real. She stayed there until dawn. The rain slowed to a hush. Light filtered through the window in gray threads. The forest sighed like it had been holding something in. She wrote in her own notebook, "He's real. He's kind," then underlined it twice. When she returned to Riverton, Sam didn't ask where she'd gone. He didn't need to. But when she sat beside him that evening, holding his hand, she saw it in his eyes. He already knew. And something in his chest, something too broken for language, had finally begun to rest. Because now someone else had seen what he saw. Now someone else would remember. It took 3 weeks for Caroline to convince the hospice board to let Sam leave. 3 weeks of meetings, calls, silence, and stubborn refusals masked as concern. She knew their reasons. Liability, safety, precedent. She didn't blame them. Not really. But none of that mattered anymore. Because when a man's eyes are already half past the veil and all he asks is to go home, you don't answer with policy. You answer with mercy. Sam never asked twice. He didn't have to. It was in the way he looked at the horizon through that east-facing window. Like he wasn't afraid of dying, just of dying in the wrong place. She didn't ask permission after that. She made a plan. Sam was too weak to protest when she wheeled him into the ambulance herself, bundled in every wool blanket she could find and tucked in with the care of someone who knew what cold could do to a body that had already started to leave. The driver was an old friend. No paperwork, no route listed. Just one quiet favor. They left Riverton before sunrise. The roads out toward Hollow Creek were rougher than she remembered. Potholes hidden under wind-blown snow, sharp turns chiseled into old rock. No signage except what she carried in her mind. But Sam's breathing stayed steady, a thin line of vapor from his mouth rising and falling in rhythm with the white sky. The silence inside the ambulance wasn't sterile like the hospital. It felt like it was holding something sacred. When they reached the tree line, the driver slowed. Caroline stepped out, boots sinking into fresh powder. There was no wind, no birds, just stillness, and then it came. A sound, low and long, rising from deep in the timber like the forest itself had drawn breath. The driver looked up, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" Caroline didn't answer. She stepped forward, brushing snow off the hood, then stopped. Through the thin mist, half veiled by pines and standing in a shaft of light so pale it barely touched the ground, a figure appeared. Massive, upright, not moving, not hiding, just there. The Bigfoot stood half in shadow, half in morning sun. Over 8 feet tall, built like a mountain with limbs shaped by the wild, fur dark but not matted, shoulders wide beneath the low-hanging boughs. It didn't blink. It didn't snarl. It watched with stillness that felt almost ceremonial. And Caroline understood, in that moment, that this wasn't a meeting. It was a welcome. She nodded once. The creature didn't move, but something in the air shifted, like permission had been granted. They drove the rest of the way in silence. The cabin was still there, untouched. Like time had waited politely outside its walls. The driver carried Sam in, gentle as lifting a newborn. The old man's head lolled slightly, but his eyes were open. They flicked toward the hearth, the chair, the carved word on the wall, and finally, the window. Caroline set him down on the wooden bed near the window, the one that had once faced the creek. The mattress was firm. The quilts smelled of cedar. She tucked the corners, brushed hair from his forehead, and sat beside him. Outside, it had started snowing again. The flakes drifted in slow spirals, soft and deliberate. And then the trees stirred. Not the wind. Not animals. Something heavier. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. As if the forest itself was exhaling. Through the cabin window, Caroline saw him again. Rune. He emerged from the timber without sound, his feet pressing into snow without leaving collapse. The snow barely gave beneath him, as if even the ground didn't want to let him go. He walked forward, each step quieter than the last. He didn't approach the cabin fully. He stopped at the porch and placed one hand against the wooden frame of the doorway. Sam lifted his arm, frail and trembling, but it rose. He pressed his hand to the inside of the window, fingers barely spreading. A mirror gesture. Not touching, but close. And there it was again, that space between two beings who had no language for each other, but understood something deeper than any name. They stayed like that for a long while. No one spoke. The only sound was the low hiss of the fire in the stove and the soft patter of snow on the roof. Caroline stepped back from the window. She didn't want to intrude. She watched from the shadows as Rune lowered his head, just slightly, then turned and disappeared into the trees with a grace that felt impossible for something so large. But she knew he wasn't leaving. Not really. He was waiting. That night Sam didn't speak, but his eyes never left the window. The light from the stove flickered across his face, catching the faint smile at the corner of his mouth. And when Caroline whispered, "You're home now," he blinked once, slow and sure. She pulled a chair beside his bed, wrapped herself in a blanket, and stayed. No IVs, no alarms, no artificial lights. Just wood heat and breath and the kind of quiet that means everything's where it's supposed to be. Outside, the wind picked up, but not in a threatening way. It moved like a song sung low by something ancient. Caroline closed her eyes for a moment, and in that stillness she felt it. Not fear, not awe, something softer, a presence. And for the first time in her life, she didn't doubt the impossible, because she had seen it, and it had seen her. And in that moment between two worlds, the fading breath of a man and the enduring watch of something more, there was peace. But not the kind that ends anything. The kind that tells you the story still has more to say. The snow had thickened that night like the world was holding its breath. Nothing stirred beyond the glass. Not the wind, not the birds, not even the thin branches brushing the roof. Caroline sat by the old stove, cross-legged beneath a worn quilt, watching the orange glow flicker against the log walls. The room was warm but quiet. Not the kind of quiet that felt empty, but the kind that knew it was being shared. Behind her, Sam slept in the old pine bed by the window, his chest rising slow, breath so light it barely moved the blanket. The hospice oxygen tank sat unplugged in the corner. He didn't need it anymore. Not here. Not now. On the first night, she'd stayed up long after the fire should have burned down. But it never did. The wood popped, the coals breathed, and the air around her stayed filled with a strange kind of stillness. She thought she saw something move past the window once, a shadow big enough to blot out the trees. But when she looked, there was only the forest. Still, she knew. He was there. By the second night, she'd stopped checking. The air told her everything she needed to know. A weight in the wind, a hush in the trees. Rune wasn't far. He never came into the cabin, never tapped the glass, but Caroline could feel him, a shape leaning gently against the outside wall, a heat just beyond the threshold. She lit a single candle near the window and left the curtains open, the way Sam had always done in the old stories. He was watching, not with eyes full of curiosity, but with something deeper, with a kind of silence that mourns without demanding to be heard. On the third night, the fire shifted suddenly, just enough to make the shadows dance. She rose from the chair to check on the kindling and caught a sound she hadn't heard in years. Leaves being stepped on, heavy, careful, not stomping, not stalking, just pacing. Rune. She reached for the door, then paused. There was no need to open it. Not yet. The fourth night brought no sound, no movement. Only a soft pressure in the floorboards, like someone leaning gently against the far side of the porch. Caroline stayed up that night too, listening to the stove breathe, counting the quiet seconds between gusts of wind. When she opened the door at dawn, there were no footprints. Just a ring melted into the snow where the frost had never touched. By the fifth night, Sam's voice had grown thinner, words flickering like candlelight. He didn't speak much, just looked at her sometimes with that same look she'd seen back at the facility. Half here, half gone, but still fighting to feel the air on his skin a little longer. She stayed near him that evening, resting her head on the edge of the bed, her hand wrapped around his. His fingers twitched once, not weak, but purposeful, and he whispered something so faint she almost missed it. "He's near." It wasn't fear. It was comfort. She looked to the window, and this time she saw him, just for a second. A massive shadow sitting upright beyond the porch, back straight, arms resting on knees. Watching, guarding. The snow settled gently on his shoulders, unmoving. His face turned slightly toward the window, amber eyes reflecting the firelight inside. She didn't cry. Not yet. The sixth night brought wind, a steady moaning breeze that made the trees sway and the cabin groan. But inside, everything held steady. The fire stayed bright. Sam's breath, though thin, came easier than before. She checked his pulse once, barely there. But his face was calm, not tense like in the hospital, not afraid. He was listening. That's all. Outside, the porch creaked once, then fell still. On the seventh night, Caroline dared to open the door, just for a moment. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she didn't step out. Instead, she stood in the frame, staring into the trees. Rune wasn't visible, but she could feel him, deeper in the dark. She didn't speak, only nodded, then closed the door gently and stoked the fire again. That night, she dreamed of hoofprints in the snow, of horses following silent trails cleared through the woods, of hands like tree bark weaving wreaths out of pine. When she woke, the dream clung to her like the scent of smoke. The eighth night was when Sam stirred for the last time. He opened his eyes as if from a long nap, lids fluttering, breath thin. She leaned in close. "You stayed," he whispered. His lips curled at the edges. Not quite a smile, but something warmer. She looked out the window. Rune was standing in the snow now, closer than before. His face was clearer in the moonlight, human-like wild man face, with pale skin beneath the dark fur, short beard blending into his cheeks, the eyes expressive and heavy with meaning. There was sadness in them, but something more, understanding. Rune didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching Sam. Caroline touched Sam's shoulder. He didn't look away from the window. "You're not alone," she said, voice low. He nodded once. The candle beside the bed flickered. Outside, the wind paused, just enough to make space for goodbye. By the ninth night, Rune had returned to the shadows, but the snow near the porch never fully iced over again. Each morning, Caroline found the wood stacked higher than she remembered. Once, the door latch had been gently turned, not opened, just touched, like someone checking in, making sure. Sam slept more, didn't speak again, but his face was never troubled. Caroline began to hum quietly at night, songs she barely remembered from her own childhood. She wasn't sure why. It just felt right. And the fire never went out. On the 10th night, the sky was clear. Stars scattered like ash over the black velvet of the sky. Sam's breath came slower now. Gaps between each rise. His fingers twitched once, as if reaching for something just outside this world. She held his hand tighter. He didn't open his eyes, but she felt him let go. Not with fear, not with pain, with trust. The fire didn't crack that night. It pulsed, steady, warm. When the last breath left Sam, it felt like something lighter than air rose with it. A shift in the room, not loss, completion. Outside, there was no sound, but Caroline stepped onto the porch anyway, not caring about the cold, not even noticing it. Rune was gone, but on the wooden railing, where the snow had dusted everything in silver, one wide handprint remained, pressed into frost, melted through to the wood. She stared at it for a long time, then knelt beside it, laid her hand where his had been. It was still warm. The boards beneath it still held the heat of something too old to name, and when she turned to go back inside, she saw the edge of a blanket, one she hadn't brought, folded carefully at the foot of the bed. She covered Sam with it, then sat by the fire and listened to the quiet. And for the first time in her life, it didn't feel empty. It felt watched. It felt held. And somewhere deep in the trees, beyond sight, beyond reason, something massive paused between one breath and the next, listening, staying. Because loyalty doesn't vanish with death. It lingers, in the wood, in the silence, in the space between two lives, woven together without ever needing a single word. By spring, the snow had receded like a memory that no longer hurt to carry. The road into Hollow Creek was still washed out in places, still hidden beneath last year's leaves and half-frozen ruts. But Caroline knew it by feel now. She didn't use a map. She didn't need one. She returned in silence, the way you do when visiting someone you loved who isn't there anymore but might still be watching. The old Jeep rattled up the incline, tires biting the thawed ground, and when the trees finally opened to the clearing, her breath caught in her throat. Not from grief this time, but from something else. Something like peace. The cabin stood just as they'd left it. Not a shutter broken. Not a door ajar. the stovepipe still leaning at its old crooked angle. There were no signs of trespass, no tracks, no litter, just the quiet presence of a place that had been held, not abandoned, not forgotten. Kept. She stepped out of the Jeep, boots crunching in the last brittle crust of snow hiding beneath the pines. A soft breeze moved through the clearing, carrying with it the first warm breath of spring. The air was wet and alive. She closed her eyes, letting it settle over her shoulders, and for a moment, she felt like the trees remembered her, like they'd paused to acknowledge her return. The front door creaked open under her hand. Inside, nothing had changed. The wool blankets folded at the foot of the bed. The wood stove clean, swept out with care. No dust, no cobwebs. Even the dried herbs Sam had hung over the sink, lavender, sage, still held their shape, as if someone had tended to them when the frost set in. She touched the edge of the counter, eyes scanning the room. It was impossible. It should have smelled of mold or rodents, of neglect. But it didn't. It smelled of cedar, of quiet, of being looked after. She walked through the small cabin, her fingertips trailing the grain of the walls. The word was still there. Rune. Carved deep and certain, a name more than a word now. She paused there, resting her hand flat against it. It was smooth to the touch, as if time had worn it down like river rock. But the depth of it hadn't faded. Behind the cabin, the ground was soft, the earth damp and dark from the melt. She walked slowly, each step sinking just enough to leave a print. The little fenced-off patch Sam had built years ago was still there, tucked beneath the shadow of a leaning spruce. His grave. A simple mound, a ring of stones around a flat, weathered marker. She knelt in front of it. Someone had been here. The grass was pressed down on one side, a wide, deliberate shape imprinted into the earth. Not boots, not hooves. Just a shallow hollow in the soil, curved like something large had rested there. Like something had sat beside the grave for a long, long time. She didn't need to guess who. Her throat tightened. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, smoothed piece of wood. Carved gently in her apartment on a night when sleep wouldn't come. The first time she'd ever tried. It wasn't perfect. A figure. Rough shoulders, broad back. She pressed it into the soil beside the headstone. It sank easily, like the ground had been waiting for it. She sat for a while, not crying, not talking, just being. The sun warmed the tops of the trees. Meltwater dripped from the tips of the branches, falling like slow applause onto the moss below. A raven croaked once overhead, then fluttered off into the distant canopy. She rose eventually, wiping her hands on her jeans. As she turned to head back toward the cabin, something caught her eye. Up in the pine above the grave, hanging loosely from a crook in the branches, a tuft of fur swayed in the breeze. Dark, coarse. Long strands tangled together, glinting slightly in the morning light. She stepped closer and reached up, fingers brushing the edge of it. Not caught, not torn, placed. She smiled softly, cupping it in her palm for a moment before letting it go. It drifted to the ground like it belonged there. She didn't take it with her. Some things weren't meant to be kept. By late afternoon, the creek had started to rise again. The air was thick with the sound of snowmelt. Steady, rushing, endless. The kind of sound that pulls winter out of the soil and lets the forest breathe again. Caroline stood at the edge of the stream, watching the current shimmer in gold where the light hit it. Small twigs bobbed along its path. The rocks had been turned smooth by years of this rhythm, this cycle. When she looked down, she noticed another mark. Pressed into the soil just beside the bend. A trail, one wide deep print, toes splayed, a heel that disappeared into the bank. And another, leading away from the grave, following the line of the water. She followed them only with her eyes. They didn't go far. They ended at the edge of the wood where the light faded into shadow, where a new season waited. She didn't follow. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked slowly back to the cabin, opened the door, and left it open behind her. There was no need to close it. The room filled with warm air, bird songs slipping in through the windows, and the soft creak of the roof settling as the last patches of snow slipped off into the yard. She looked once more at the chair by the window, then at the stove. Then she set the kettle down gently, as if someone might come in soon, just in case, because sometimes we don't open doors to let things in. Sometimes we open them so something that was always there knows it can stay. When she left, she didn't lock the door. She didn't even close it all the way. The forest would take care of it now. It already had. As she drove back down the trail, the trees leaned gently in the breeze. The sun slanted low, spilling golden light across the hood of the Jeep. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. But in the mirror, she thought she saw a figure at the edge of the clearing, standing tall, still, watching the way he always had. Not asking, not calling, just keeping watch. And somewhere in her chest, that old ache Sam had carried so long, the one that feared no one would believe, it finally let go. The story hadn't ended. It had passed on. As she reached the highway, the wind picked up slightly, tugging at her sleeve as if to remind her, he found you again, and you brought him home, and home will never be empty again. There are stories that rise like wind through the pines, quiet at first, almost too soft to notice, until they settle somewhere deep inside you and stay. Not because they are loud or filled with grand gestures, but because they speak to something older, something that lives in all of us. The need to be seen, to be remembered, to be loved, not for what we are, but for how we choose to stay when the world grows quiet. This was never a story about monsters or myths. It was a story about what happens when someone chooses compassion over fear, about the unspoken bonds that can form between hearts that were never meant to cross paths, yet somehow do. It's about the kind of loyalty that doesn't ask for recognition, the kind of love that asks for nothing in return but remains anyway. Through snowstorms and silence, through years and memory and the hush of time moving on. Sometimes the most powerful promises are the ones never spoken aloud. They're written in the way we show up, the way we remember, the way we leave a door open, not because we expect someone to walk through it, but because we believe they still might. We live in a world that often demands proof before faith. But some truths don't fit inside photographs or science or stories neatly tied with bows. Some truths live in the way a chair is turned to catch the morning light, in the warmth left behind on an old wooden rail, in a presence we feel when the room is otherwise empty. Maybe the point of a story like this isn't to convince, but to remind. That kindness outlives the hands that offer it. That silence isn't always absence. And that sometimes the wildest things in this world are also the most human. If we listen closely, to the trees, to the wind, to one another, we might still catch the echoes of what came before, of what's still out there, watching, waiting, guarding, not because it must, but because it chooses to. So the next time you find yourself alone in the quiet, and the air feels different, like it's holding its breath just for a moment, don't rush to fill it. Sit with it, feel it. Let it remind you that you're part of something larger, that even in the loneliest places, we are never truly alone. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, even just a little, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like more stories like this, filled with heart, mystery, and meaning, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, or sharing with someone who could use a little quiet magic. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and remember, some doors are meant to stay open,